As entrepreneurs, we all have a reason why we chose to leave our 9 to 5 for an 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. I'm here to capture those stories of why we all hustle and grind for our companies. Mark Albert is the founder and CEO of Media Advisory Experts and is a Peabody and Emmy Award-winning master storyteller. Mark's 25-year journalism career is distinguished by investigative and political reporting, innovative storytelling techniques, and creative communications. He's traveled the world for CBS News and reported for the White House, Capitol Hill, and the U.S. Supreme Court, and created and led a national investigative unit for Hearst Communications. He's taught journalists in newsrooms in the U.S., Vietnam, and Pakistan, has launched an online news startup and podcast about travel news and deals, and creates a media database to drive countless earned media appearances. Mark has won some of the biggest honors in journalism while landing high-profile national interviews, including with philanthropist and tech pioneer Bill Gates, government and political leaders at history-making moments, and visionary creators. He's been invited to bring his energetic, passionate speaking to audiences around the world. Well, Mark, I have to say that I am incredibly honored to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I have to say, you're the first. You have a first for this podcast. You're the first person that's won an Emmy that's been on my podcast. So I have to say, I get that's a big deal, man. So because we're all about the stories, I want to kind of hear a little bit about how that started and what you do and how you came to win an Emmy.
Well, Andrew, I have to take you all the way back to when I was 11, if we can go back that far. I know it's a long time because I've got the gray hair to prove it, but let's go back in time to when I was 11, and I started to use my allowance to buy the Sunday edition of the LA Times. And I would get so mad if my dad would go down the driveway and get it before I was awake, because I wanted that fresh newspaper in my hand and I wanted to smell it and I wanted to be the first to open the pages. And I just became very curious. And so I also started watching the local news. I was in Los Angeles growing up. And then I got to high school and I created the TV production club, and we would do a newscast once a quarter. You know, I was the very serious anchor. Then when I went to USC, it was very obvious what I was going to be doing, journalism. And in fact, I remember as a senior in high school, going to USC, sitting through a prospective student orientation with my mom, and these former students who were now anchors and reporters and producers talking about all the stories that they're covering and the people they're interviewing. And I turned to my mom and I said, that's what I want to do with the rest of my life. It was just so clear, Andrew. I never wavered on my major. I never changed when I was in college. And I was ready to graduate like by the end of the sophomore year. I was like, okay, let's get this show on the road here. And so that curiosity has served me so well in life, in journalism, and also in my personal life. We can talk later, but I'm trying to get to every country in the world because I'm so curious about other cultures. And so I was reporting on TV in a very small market, Redding, Chico, California, up north. And then you bounce to Michigan and Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo. Some of your listeners may know where that is on the, like we say in Michigan with the hand, right? It's here, you got the thumb in Saginaw, Detroit down here, and you got the UP, the Upper Peninsula up here. So we were over there right by Lake Michigan. And then I went to Minneapolis, and I was in Minneapolis. I was an investigative reporter for the ABC affiliate. And we were covering the Iraq War. And one day I got assigned to do a story, just a one-day story for the 10 o'clock news on this local sailor, David Cedergren. And he had been serving in Iraq, and he was killed. He was found dead in the showers on a U.S. base near Scandaria, Iraq. And I remember going to talk to his father, and it was several years after the death. And the Pentagon had announced that it was one of 18 cases they were reopening because of suspicious circumstances. And I remember having interviewed the dad, and on the way back to the station, telling the photographer, the videographer I was with in the car, I can't believe that 4 years later, this family doesn't really know how their loved one died. The military had told them originally it was an undiagnosed heart ailment. Well, listen, the father was a former, guy who did autopsies. The sister was a nurse. They all got checked out. Nobody else in the family has an undiagnosed heart ailment. So I started filing public records requests. This is one of the great laws called Freedom of Information Act. It's on behalf of all of our listeners here, and you can request public records. And the military denied our request. We had a fight. We had to appeal. I finally get them back. Andrew, it was like this thick of a file. And I started reading, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. It said that at this base where he died, that the electrical problems were so bad that sparks would jump up from the ground when it rained because of exposed electrical wiring, that other Marines had been burned, electrical burns in those very showers, and that the base commanders knew there were problems. But you know how they went to go fix it? They looked for local Iraqis. And how did they choose an Iraqi electrician to service the base where American servicemen and women were living? They picked the oldest. Why? Because in the report it said they figured if they lived that long, they must know what they were doing. Not certifications, not past experience, but if they were older. And so we dug and dug and dug. We got power of attorney from the family to get the autopsy photos. We went to autopsy specialists. It turned out that he was electrocuted in that shower, that death was completely preventable. We got answers and documents for the family that even their lawyers couldn't get. And the Armed Forces Medical Examiner, after our report aired, changed the way that the remains of American service members killed overseas are tracked. That won the Peabody Award, which is like the Pulitzer in broadcast. It won a bunch of other awards. But what I'm most grateful about that story is that it got answers for a family that didn't have them.
And I think that's something that we hear a lot of things about the media. And I think that's one thing that the media can often do is by shining light on these things and bringing them to light and really digging in. And I have a huge amount of respect for investigative reporters because of what you do, things like what you had done, where it's like you're saying even the lawyers can't get answers, even, these people that are supposed to be experts that should be able to get, the law says should be able to get this information. And just with sheer doggedness and something doesn't seem right. And, what do I need to dig deeper into this. I need to be more curious about this. I need to answer some questions because something here doesn't make sense to me. And I give you a huge amount of credit for that. I think, that Emmy was very well won. I mean, and it was nice to be, I'm happy to see that you were recognized for it as well. That that is an amazing story. I love being the story guy. So that's something that, that is an amazing story, man. That's yeah.
Well, thank you. And I have to credit the family for being willing to tell their story. And that was very traumatic for them. And if they weren't willing to share, we wouldn't be able to get answers. But the other thing, Andrew, I would say is that there are tenacious, dogged journalists across the country. And if your listeners want to support that kind of journalism, subscribe to your local newspaper, listen to your local television station, follow your local news radio. That is the way that you can support journalism in your communities and the accountability that we all as the public deserve.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that accountability is something that sometimes can be lost, and having somebody to stand up and say this doesn't make sense, and somebody who has the audaciousness to be able to say I'm going to make this right, and that is a laudable endeavor, and I really appreciate that a lot. So there's only a few other times on the podcast where I've kind of just been almost speechless just with stories because they're just so, that this specific one was really powerful. But so I'd like to go back to a little bit about this amazing career that you've had because you've been in the industry for about 25 years or so. What is the number one thing you've learned from your career? Like, what are the top things that you have learned from your career throughout 25 years worth of covering various news events?
So I would say one of the top things is that somebody is always trying to hide something. And especially in government and corporations, they're likely going to do everything they can to prevent you from getting the truth. Now, this is the thing. I'm very passionate about journalism and seeking the truth on behalf of the public. And I want your listeners to know that this is happening every day in newsrooms across America, that journalists are shining a light on fraud, waste, and abuse, not for them and not to sell newspapers. It is for you, the public. That is why journalists do what they do. And so what I've learned in journalism is that often when you ask questions, people don't want to answer them. And people are allergic to sunlight because the old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so one of the things I've learned is you have to keep asking questions and you have to keep digging. And when you can't get the answers or someone doesn't want to give you the documents, you have to scratch your head and you have to think to yourself, why? Why do they not want me to know this information? And it's probably because somebody's trying to hide something or they're embarrassed or doing something they shouldn't be doing. So that's one thing. The second thing I've learned is that the power of asking a question should never be underestimated. We live in an amazing country. because I can ask the question of the president of the United States, and I covered the White House for CBS News for a time, or you can ask it of that family, the Cedergren family in Minnesota. And both of them will likely answer your question, or at least not throw you in jail for asking it, right? That's an amazing thing that many countries don't honor. And so one of the things that I learned is that you lose nothing by asking the question. And I'll give you an example. There was this one time I've covered many cases, court cases. There was this one time when somebody was arrested. I think it was a murder or something really serious, and all the media was camped out on this mother's doorstep, right? The mother of the suspect, and we got there last. And you talk amongst reporters, and they said, "Hey, we've all knocked on the door. She's all told us to go away. They're not giving any statement. They're not giving any pictures. No, nothing." So my job is, what am I going to say? What question am I going to ask that will elicit a different response, that will tell a story? So I thought about it and I thought about it, and I walked up to the door, and I knocked on the door, and she answered. She goes, "I'm not talking to any media. All of your friends came by and I don't want to talk to them." And I said, "I realize that." I said, "All I want to say is this. The sheriff's office has put out a mugshot of your son, and all the media organizations are going to run that mugshot. But I suspect that there are pictures that you have that paint a different story, that you would rather be used other than just the mugshot. So you don't need to talk to me, and I won't do an interview. But if there are other photos you would want us to incorporate into a story along with the mugshot, now is your chance." She gave me photos that nobody else had, because my question was, "I'm sure there are other photos you have. Would you like me to incorporate?" We're not getting rid of the mugshot, right? It's newsworthy. We have to use it. But it was treating that person like a human with compassion and empathy, and saying, is there something that we can do for you to make this a fair story and incorporate your point of view? And so I've always learned the power of a question. Even when people tell you they're not going to talk to you, or your colleagues say it's worthless, don't ask. It's that tenacity, that doggedness to say, "I'm going to ask my question, and I have to put myself in their shoes."
Yeah.
Right? We can't forget the other person on the other side of the camera, right? The other person, they always have a story to tell. And so you need to identify with the people that you're covering and those stories. And let's see, a third thing that I've learned, which is no matter the criticism, and journalists get a lot of criticism, especially the last 7 or 8 years, it's been incredible. The amount of threats are uncalled for. No matter what you think of journalists, you can't have a free society without them.
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson recognized this. John Adams recognized this. You cannot have a democracy and a free society without an independent press. And I don't want to hear about any, corporate media and all this stuff. All these newsrooms have ethics. They have standards. Your partisan media on either side, often they don't have those. The websites on Facebook, these other social media where you're getting some of your political news, they don't have that either. Only with independent journalism, your local newspaper, your local TV station, local radio, the networks, etc., they're doing groundbreaking work to hold people accountable for you, for the public. And all I would say is we need to appreciate our local journalists, because if you look at countries where they are in prison, in jail, assaulted, prevented from telling the truth, that's not a democracy. And that's not what Americans have chosen for the over 220 years.
And I know that's one of the things, and it's an incredibly contentious topic right now, is journalism. I think there's a lot of things that have been said. And so I guess what I'd like to do is also to ask you that question too, and to say there's a lot of things there's a lot of these gossip, and that's exactly where I'm going to put it, about, well, there's this collusion of this, or the media is just saying what they think they need to say. And you're saying that it's more the local side of things. What is your response to that? And what do you think people can do if they think that the media is not being, I want to word this really carefully because I don't want to, it's again, very contentious question. But what I say is, if you hear people saying that they think that the media is just giving them a line, or they think that they're being partisan, what would you say to that? And how would you in their minds kind of change the way that they're viewing it?
So I was a journalist for 25 years,
Yeah.
Local, regional, national, and I stepped away last year, and I'm doing media training now.
Yeah.
In my 25 years, Andrew, I want you to guess how many times a fellow reporter came to me and said, I believe X, even though I know Y to be true, and I'm going to go with my partisan bent in this story. Do you know how many times that happened in 25 years? None.
No. Good.
None.
Good.
Contrary to whatever you're hearing from your favorite politician or on Facebook, journalists are working hard every day with standards and ethics and rules to bring you the news, the facts, the information. You know what? It doesn't matter a hill of beans to me if you agree or you don't agree. These are the facts. And it's my job, it was my job as a journalist, to bring you those facts so that you can make an informed decision. Whether you believe me or not, I can't do anything about that. All I can do is give you the truth. And so for folks who want to say that journalists are deliberately slanting stories, that they have a personal stake or a financial stake, it just isn't true by and large. Now, of course, there are bad apples in any industry that you want to say. I'm sure there's a podcast host that's bad, not you, of course, but I'm sure there's one in the industry somewhere.
Yeah.
But and I'm sure that's the case. We've had isolated cases in journalism of plagiarism. There was a very famous one at the New York Times where a reporter was just making things up. But by and large, we are so well served in this country by a free and independent and fearless press that is trying to hold people accountable and get you the truth. So all I would say is the next time that you read something that immediately boils up an emotion inside you, you need to take a step back and wonder, is what I'm reading purposely trying to make me emotional? And do I need to go to independent media sources to hear what is actually happening? Because so many of us now, Andrew, we're going into our silos. We're only reading what we want to read. And I've got to think back to my mom, and she said I couldn't have ice cream every night, that I had to have my vegetables and meat too. And so in our news diet, we can't just be getting all of our ice cream, things that make us feel mad or really enraged or something, an emotion. We need to search out news sources that make sure that we're informed. That's why I love holding the newspaper, why I love watching the news, because that means there's a team of editors and journalists and producers that are putting together an objective look at what's important in the day's news. It's not my silo. It's what's happening in the world. And what I really fear right now, Andrew, is that so many of us are retreating to our partisan corners. We're only getting the news we agree with. That is not serving us well as a society. Do you know how many millions of people are duped right now on various things? It is alarming, and it's largely because they are not consuming objective news sources.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of it too has to do with social media, because we're now being fed news that backs up what we're doing, and that's basically tailored to what we need versus, objective news from a variety of different sources. It's like targeted advertising, but it's more targeted news. At least that's what I'm seeing kind of in social media. I don't know if you've seen that as well, but it seems like we're in our own echo chambers. And I think it was really, I wanted to ask this question. I wanted to do it respectfully, but I wanted to ask this question because I think it's something I would rather ask a question and know the answer than kind of duck around it. And so, as a reporter, I think that's something that you've done as well, probably very regularly over 25 years, is asking those questions, like you just said, asking those questions and trying to getting an actual answer versus something just kind of that we either make up or is partisan or is a part of our echo chamber or the silo that we happen to be in.
Yeah. If you are not subscribing to a source of news that doesn't make you angry all the time, then I would submit that you're not getting news that you need to be an informed citizen. And the social media platforms, look, I'm going to tell you that they are an amazing reporting tool. Do you know how many sources that I found on social media or people that have sent me news through the years on social media? It has been an incredible reporting tool. But on the other hand, we have a responsibility on our end not to fall for whatever the algorithm is feeding us. If the algorithm is saying that right now it is snowing in downtown Los Angeles and it's July, we need to be able to objectively determine it's not snowing in Los Angeles in July, right? No matter how much we want it to be true and no matter how many ads we see about it or other posts from our friends on Facebook. So, we do have a responsibility in a democracy to be informed citizens. And so I don't want to get all weighty and everything, but too many of us, I think, are falling into this cycle where we are getting emotional about things that are in our feeds or that we're seeing. We're not taking a step back and being objective and looking for news sources that we may not agree with, but that we can respect that they are covering the news objectively.
Mm-hmm. And you keep mentioning that, the local independent news sources. What specifically, as far as like independent, what is your criteria for independent?
And that's a great question. There certainly has been a lot of consolidation in the industry. But what I'm
Mhm.
talking about are, so this is going to get a little bit into the weeds, but in the US, there are 210 local television news markets, 210. And in
Mhm.
most of those markets, you've got a Fox affiliate, you've got a CBS affiliate, NBC, ABC, you may have a news radio station, you've got one or two newspapers, you may have an independent online news outlet. So what I'm talking about independent news is news that, the news is not coming from a centralized location in your local community, that you have a local newsroom that is reporting. Now, certainly they could be owned by a corporate owner. Absolutely. These are called station groups. I used to work for a station group, Hearst Communications, right? They own TV stations and radio and newspapers. But Hearst was never saying in Minneapolis, you have to cover X because we believe Y,
Mhm.
right? Whereas unfortunately today, in fact, I just saw this, I think it was on Axios. They now have tallied that the number of faux or fake news sites that have a partisan bent outnumber the number of traditional newspapers.
Mhm.
So those are clearly a partisan slant that are trying to sway you. That's not an independent news source. CBS News Network, ABC News Network, they're all owned by corporations, but they have their own independent editorial process. That's what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. And I think again, it's a really hot button issue. And I like to hear the side from, your side of it, where it's like, this is what we think it is. And having that other option is, I think, something that's really necessary for us as well. So I'd like to kind of just pivot here for a second. And while we're kind of wrapping things up, and I want to get back to a couple of good questions for you, because I know you've got, with 25 years of experience on doing things, you have a specific skill set that really can help people, I think, even in just their daily life that they may not realize. So let's start with this, because podcasts are a huge thing. So one thing I'd like to ask about, what is, if somebody were on a podcast, so I was on your podcast, you're by far more experienced at this than I am, and I'd like to learn from you. What are some things that make for a good podcast or a good interview guest, like on a TV station or something else like that?
A story. How did we
Mm,
start this podcast? You asked me about a story, and I told you a story, and you found that story to be compelling.
yeah.
And so, we're hardwired in our brains to love stories. That's why Disney is
Yeah.
so big. That's why we love going to the movies, right? Everyone loves a great story. The legendary Steve Hartman, he's a correspondent at CBS News. He used
Mm,
to do this series on the Friday CBS Evening News called Everybody Has a Story. And he would blindfold himself and he would throw a dart at a map of the US, and that would pick a random city. He'd go to that city, he'd open the phone book, and he'd randomly point in the middle of a page. And whoever's name he landed on, he would go and he would try to interview that person. And inevitably, the person says, "Oh, I don't have a story. I'm not important. I'm not interesting." He would always find a story. And so, if you're a podcast host, what is the story about your guest that is going to resonate deeply with your audience? And if you don't know it, it's your job to find it. And so I think stories, we all identify with stories, bedtime stories, stories in our news. We read novels, we watch movies. Why? Because we want to hear a great story.
yeah. And it's an effective learning. So I've been in the learning industry for almost 20 years at this point, and I'm a keynote architect, and I help people to sell things from stage. And part of what that is that's that storytelling, because we're wired from a young age to learn from those stories. I mean, for me, it's like it's preaching to the choir, because I love stories. I've done it since I was young. We've I like helping people to be able to do that. I just had an interview earlier on. I was on a podcast and told somebody, people are always scared of speaking. That's people's number one fear, and what it is, it's a fear of being judged, or a fear of not coming across as coherent. And so often with clients, I'll start with a story, because I can tell a story better than I can list off some facts, and it gets people in that moment. It gets them emotional. It gets them engaged, and then it just becomes a really fun process.
I'll tell you what, you gave me a perfect segue because I actually have a tip sheet, 6 tips to be a better public speaker.
Oh,
And
nice.
so if any of your listeners are interested, all you have to do is text the word media,
Mm.
right? How appropriate. Text the
Uh-huh.
word media to 33777, 33777, media to 33777. We'll send you that tip sheet for free. And also, Andrew, we're super excited about this media training event. As you mentioned, I've had 25 years in broadcast journalism, and now I'm doing a multi-day in-person media training event. We're going to do a mock interview on a set, a block from the White House with me on camera, do a mock podcast interview. We're going to do headshots. You're going to be on a stage. We're going to talk about personal branding, marketing, how to elevate your LinkedIn profile, body language, voice, intonation. It's coming up in September in DC. And so if you text media to 33777, we'll be happy to send you all the details.
That sounds like fun. I know you were talking about it earlier, and that sounds like an amazing event and something that really could help a lot of people. I love that. I love that. So while we're winding down, there's one question I always ask every person, and that is, what is a podcast or a book that has significantly impacted your life?
Ooh, that's a great question. Oh boy. I will say, I'm going to Google real quick because I forgot. It's
Good.
Thomas E. Ricks. He has covered the military for a very long time, and I'm going to pull up Making the Corps. Making the Corps by Thomas E. Ricks. It is a story about the Marine Corps, and he follows essentially, he goes to boot camp, and he follows this group of Marines in boot camp, and he follows them for years. And you know what it is? It is a story of our times. The book is now, I think, probably 15 or 20 years old. But I have reread that book about 3 or 4 times because you capture in the pages of those books the sacrifice that these Marines make on behalf of our country, their maturity and development from the day they step on those yellow footprints at MCRD. And I think it was MCRD San Diego or Parris Island. I can't remember which one. And they go through boot camp, and then you see them years later when they're serving their countries overseas or here in the US. And it's an amazing story of how they grow, but how we grow as a country and the sacrifices that are made on our behalf. And so I respect his journalism. I respect his storytelling. And I would love for him to do a follow-up. Thomas E. Ricks, if you're listening to this podcast, I would love for you to do a follow-up now 10 or 15 or 20 years later with those same Marines and find out where they are now.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark, for all of the wisdom you've dropped on us. I really, really appreciate it. I love getting new perspectives on things. You've definitely given us a new perspective today. Again, thank you so much. Honored to have you on the podcast.
Andrew, such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for joining us on the Hustle and Grind podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Mark, check out the link in the show description.